Hey guys, Thyworm here, and today I want to talk about why you are struggling with boss fights in Last Epoch. Are you bad at the game? Are the bosses too difficult? Are you undergeared or underleveled? I don't think it's necessarily any of these things. Let me explain. I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and last week Mike in his stream touched on this topic again after a viewer asked if he thinks bosses are too difficult. I think it's safe to say this viewer was struggling probably, and I think plenty of people are, especially new players. Let me play the clip and then we get into it.
I think a lot of the time there's room for people to improve their characters, room for people to learn the boss mechanics better. And I don't think too many bosses are actually really overpowered in our game right now. I wouldn't say. I could be wrong about that. It's a really difficult thing for someone who plays the game a lot to evaluate, especially for people who are newer with the game, because they're fights that you learn a lot.
In this short section, Mike is saying three things. 1. You can improve your character. That means in all sorts of ways, right? Better gear, better skills, better build, and for new players I would definitely recommend following a build guide. I have plenty of those, they're very extensive and beginner friendly, and it just allows you to play the game without having to worry too much about if your character is going to be okay at higher levels. And then as soon as you understand more and more of the game, you can make your own builds. You can subscribe for more build guides and opinion pieces on Last Epoch, or you like the video, I appreciate it. Number 2, you can learn the boss fights. And my argument in this video is going to be that Last Epoch makes it extremely difficult to learn the boss fights. And 3, Mike thinks the bosses aren't overpowered. And I agree with that actually, mostly. Let's talk a bit about bosses in Last Epoch. Mike said this as well, and I think he's right in mentioning that boss fights in Last Epoch require both mechanical knowledge of the boss fights and a decent build and gear. The latter you can work on, but getting the mechanical knowledge of a boss fight, that is very difficult. I agree that bosses are not overpowered, but I do feel Last Epoch does a bad job at teaching people new boss fights and giving them opportunities to fail and retry. First, let's talk about teaching boss fights. Last Epoch is designed in a way that boss fights do not mechanically change at higher tiers or higher difficulty. The fights are always the same fights, it is just that ability scaling and damage scaling and health scaling is cranked up significantly. I guess it makes sense, I'm actually not sure it makes sense, but it is also problematic, because the first time you encounter these bosses, they are typically so weak that mechanics do not matter at all. The tier 1 dungeon bosses are a joke. The tier 2 dungeon bosses are a joke as well. You don't have to worry about the mechanics at all. The tier 3 bosses can get challenging, and the tier 4 bosses one-shot you, and then people suddenly start complaining. Maybe the devs would argue that you had ample opportunity to learn the fights in the lower tiers, but I would argue that is simply not true because nothing incentivizes you to learn the fight. You can kill the bosses without knowing any mechanics, like in the Diablo 3 example Mike gave. I think it would be much better if the lower tier bosses had fewer mechanics, but the ones they have are still very deadly, so you learn some of the mechanics already, and if you screw it up, you actually get punished. This way, you help the players understand this isn't Diablo 3, but it is actually more like Path of Exile, where boss mechanics matter and where boss abilities are deadly. That would be a way to properly learn boss fights, and it would make the different tiers more interesting as well, because the bosses don't only get harder because they skill, but because they actually gain extra abilities. It makes sense then that these new abilities are also deadly because the players are already conditioned that boss abilities are deadly. It will require some tweaking, of course. You can't end up with a boss that have 5 deadly abilities, but make it do a percentage of your health or something instead of flat numbers. So people get a good jump scare and they figure out, like Pavlov's dog, that they cannot take these mechanics lightly. I'm sure the devs can think of a solution here. And besides, I would argue that the tier 4 boss actually has 5 deadly mechanics against most builds, so ultimately it wouldn't change that much. It's just that people learn the fights better. Now, you might say that I'm suggesting people should get one-shot at lower tiers as well. And yeah, I am sort of advocating that, because it would teach people the mechanics. However, I'm advocating for it because I feel Last Epoch needs a second change, on top of the first one where they teach the new player the fights in several stages. Because what Last Epoch lacks is a system where players can actually retry boss fights after they die. For some reason, Last Epoch is taking a super hardcore approach here, and it is extremely punishing, and I have no idea where this design philosophy is coming from. It seems to me this is contradicting the idea that Last Epoch should be a game more catered towards people that feel Path of Exile is too complicated. That is literally a design pillar of Last Epoch, by the way, keeping it simple. But they are not keeping it simple for new players when it comes to bosses. Not at all. If you die to a boss, you need to restart the entire dungeon. Or you need to restart the entire boss fight in the monolith, which costs stability, which you may not have, meaning you now have to do echoes again and only then you can give it another try. And this isn't the first time Last Epoch implements something that seems just ridiculously punishing. Some of the more OG players might remember that the first iteration of the Monolith of Fate reset the entire monolith when you died in an echo. Yes, ladies and gents, the devs thought it was a good idea to completely kill basically your entire stability bar if you died in a timeline. I don't know why. It was changed, of course, due to feedback. And similarly, I hope this video changes something too. Because I feel, especially for new players, but also for myself, it is very problematic that if you die on a boss, you get punished super hard. And what is interesting, there are almost no other games that do this, that I can think of at least. For example, take Path of Exile. That game has incredibly hard bosses, much harder than bosses currently available in Last Epoch and with much more mechanics, phases, entire worlds changing, you name it. But they always give you 6 attempts to try a boss fight because you get 6 portals. It can take a while before you spawn the boss again, like Cirrus in particular, but overall they give you opportunities to learn the fight. Even though the bosses are much harder than in Last Epoch and they sometimes have insane one-shot mechanics, you still feel you have a fair shot at killing them or a fair shot at learning the fight. Even a game like Elden Ring, that Mike talked about as well, has these stakes of Marika and Sites of Grace or bonfires, little checkpoints in front of difficult boss fights so that if you die, you can simply resurrect a few meters away from the boss and try again. The game gives you plenty of chances, infinite chances even, to learn the boss mechanics. If you can't kill the boss, it doesn't feel too bad because you know you can just get some levels and gear and come back later and give it 30 more tries. I think that is great design. Even a game like World of Warcraft, which has these massive raid bosses with numerous mechanics, even that game does not let you clear the trash every time you want to fight the boss, right? And every time you wipe. That would be insane. It would be like forcing your players to do the entire dungeon again. Oh wait, Last Epoch is actually doing that. WoW, however, is not designed like that. You can just revive, buff up and give it another try for 2 hours or so, and only then the trash respawns. Final Fantasy got rid of trash entirely and just puts you directly into the raid boss arena quite often, and in both cases you basically get infinite tries as long as people keep playing. In Last Epoch, this doesn't exist. Oh, you got one shot by the bugged and poorly animated Lagon? Tough shit, no retries for you. Oh, you didn't see the clock ticking at Jilra and got one shot? Tough shit. Please complete the whole dungeon again and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Let's see how well you learn the fight if you can attempt the next one in 10 minutes. Oh, the final boss of the arena killed you? Please do another 40 waves and hope you get the same boss again. It's madness and poor design. Mike states you can learn the boss fights, but I argue with these 2 points you actually can't learn the boss fights, especially as a new player. Last Epoch needs to implement something like portals, Sites of Grace or a checkpoint with some tries, or this issue is only going to get worse. And it's a real issue because the frustration these bosses cause is making people quit. I didn't play Last Epoch for months after getting one shot again by Lagon because he was still bugged and I had to do the entire timeline again. It's nonsense, it shouldn't be in the game, and Last Epoch needs to fix this. The boss fights are typically well designed and fun, but currently way too punishing and not offering players opportunities to learn the actual fights. And that's it. Let me know your feedback in the comments or by liking or disliking the video. Thanks for watching and making it to the end. See you soon. Love you all. Bye bye.